welcome. I hope everybody's doing well today. We're going to be talking about Chapter 2, which is all about some basic chemistry. And I have this lecture divided into two parts. And Chapter 2 really focuses on atomic structure, the formation of bonds between atoms, and then at the end of the chapter it talks a little bit about water, because water is very critical for life and hence for biology. Also discusses just the pH scale briefly. And so you might be wondering, okay, this is a biology class. Why are we starting out talking about chemistry? And the reason we're doing this is because where we're headed in the upcoming chapters is we want to talk about some of the basic biochemistry that keeps your cells functioning. So things like cellular respiration or photosynthesis, which is providing sugars, producing sugars. And so before we can have that discussion, we need to talk about some of these big molecules that are important for life: carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, etc. And so to understand those macromolecules, we want to start with just the basics of how do we link atoms together and start to make some of these larger molecules. So we're going to go all the way back to basic atomic structure here, and of course hopefully you're familiar with the idea of an atom and the fact that all matter is made out of atoms, and atoms themselves can be broken down into what are called subatomic particles. So this is sort of the cartoon structure of an atom, where you have what's called the atomic nucleus that contains subatomic particles called protons and neutrons. Protons are positively charged, neutrons are neutral, have no charge. So that's the atomic nucleus in the center of the atom. Don't confuse that with a cell's nucleus, which is something totally different that we'll talk about later. And then orbiting around that atomic nucleus, you have the negatively charged electrons. And now these atoms are taking up space, they have volume, and they also have mass, even though that mass is very small. So the mass of a single proton or neutron is set as 1 atomic mass unit, or sometimes you'll see that called 1 Dalton. If you wanted to put that into grams, which might be a unit you're a bit more familiar with, 1 proton or neutron would weigh 1.7 times 10 to the negative 24th grams. So that is a lot of zeros after the decimal place there. And electrons are even smaller and lighter. So in grams, they weigh 9 times 10 to the negative 28. So quite significantly smaller than protons. And electrons are so lightweight that usually in most calculations of mass, they tend to be ignored. All right, so if we're talking about atoms, we can also talk about elements, and certainly you've seen the periodic table of elements shown here. So what is an element? Well, an element is a pure substance made up of just one kind of atom. So, for example, you can have an atom of helium, you can have an atom of carbon, an atom of nitrogen. And what does that mean? Well, how would you get different types of atoms? Well, different elements, excuse me, different types of atoms are going to have different numbers of subatomic particles. So you can see in the little blow up here, helium, whose atomic number is 2, and that atomic number represents how many protons are found in the nucleus of that atom. So helium, an atom of helium is always going to have 2 protons in the atomic nucleus. Carbon, for example, its atomic number is 6, so it's always going to have 6 protons in the atomic nucleus. Okay, so every element, every atom of every element is going to be different from every other. You'll also notice each element has just an abbreviation, and also what's called an atomic weight, which I'll come back to and explain in just a minute. So we have that atomic number that's always designated pretty clearly in the periodic table of elements, that again indicates how many protons are found in an atom of that element. And sometimes you'll see that represented as a subscript. So here we've got helium, subscript 2. That number is telling you how many protons an atom of helium has. Another number I want you to know is what's called the mass number. And the mass number is typically designated as a superscript next to the abbreviation for that element. And the mass number tells you the number of protons plus the number of neutrons in the nucleus. So for example, with helium, if we know the atomic number is 2, that tells us there's 2 protons. The mass number is 4, that means we have 4 protons plus neutrons. So if we know there's 2 protons, that means there must be 2 neutrons to get us 2 plus 2 to that 4. Another example, sodium, the atomic number is 11, so there's 11 protons. And then the mass number is 23, so we would say there has to be 12 neutrons, right? So the 12 plus 11 would get us to that 23. So I'll definitely ask you some questions on subsequent tests or quizzes related to that concept. So let's do a little example here. I'll do one more for you. So magnesium, how many protons are found in an atom of magnesium? We would say there's going to be 12, right? The subscript, the atomic number is going to tell us that. How many electrons? Something we haven't talked about yet. Now, you can always assume if you know the number of protons, there's going to be an equal number of electrons. And this comes back to the idea of these subatomic particles being charged, right? So protons have a positive charge, and an atom needs to balance that out with an equivalent negative charge. So if there's 12 positively charged protons, there should also be 12 negatively charged electrons. And then how many neutrons? Again, we can go to our mass number here, which tells us the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. We know there's 12 protons, so we would have to add in another 12 neutrons to get us to 24. So this one's very symmetrical, 12, 12, 12 across the board. Now, another term I want you to know is what's called isotopes. So it turns out there can be different forms of a particular element that will have different numbers of neutrons. So, for example, hydrogen is always going to have an atomic number of 1, if you look back at the periodic table, meaning there's always going to be 1 proton in that atomic nucleus. And we talked about the fact that's always going to need to be balanced by 1 electron orbiting around. But we could mix up the number of neutrons. So sort of standard hydrogen actually has no neutrons, but they're what are called isotopes of hydrogen that do have some neutrons. So there's deuterium that has a single neutron, tritium that has 2 neutrons. So there's still hydrogen because of the number of protons and the number of electrons, but we're basically making these elements, these atoms of hydrogen, a little bit heavier by adding in these extra neutrons. And these are just naturally occurring, so you would find all of these different isotopes of hydrogen naturally existing out in the world. So this brings me back to the idea of atomic weight. You might remember that was the number at the bottom of each box in the periodic table. And atomic weight it's always a decimal number with a decimal. Is the average mass number of the isotopes of a particular element in their normally occurring proportions found in nature. So, this 10.811 for boron would be the average mass of the different isotopes of boron that are naturally occurring in their naturally occurring proportions. So just to make you aware of what that atomic weight is referring to. Now, if you've heard of isotopes, you might have heard of the term radioisotopes, or you're at least probably familiar with the idea of radioactivity. So this is referring to the fact that some isotopes are unstable, meaning they are basically decomposing, breaking down, throwing off subatomic particles over time. And there is energy associated with those subatomic particles being thrown out of these atoms. Sometimes very significant energy, right? So, um, in movies, radioactivity can give us superpowers, but in real life, most radioactivity just damages our cells and our tissues, right? That energy can actually um, cause serious problems. So we usually try to stay away from radioactivity as much as possible. Sometimes we need to be exposed to it for, X-rays or various other reasons. And radioactivity, radioisotopes, are pretty commonly used in medicine and in research to label or tag certain molecules. So, for example, a typical way to do a cancer scan, like a PET scan, for example, would be you would feed somebody radioactively labeled glucose. This would be sugar, glucose molecules that have a non-damaging radioactive element incorporated into the glucose structure. You would feed that to the patient, and the idea is that the glucose is going to accumulate in parts of the body that are metabolizing the fastest, right? Using the most energy, have the highest energy demands. And those are going to be, for example, cells that are actively dividing like cancer cells. So you would see that radioactive glucose concentrate in the tumors. And then when you scan the body to be able to detect where the radioactivity is located, you can actually see the location of those tumors. So just practical use of radioactive isotopes. All right, so really here we're talking about atomic structure because we want to discuss how we could link atoms together to start to build some bigger molecules. And really, when we're talking about forming bonds between atoms, it's generally the electrons, what the electrons are doing, or how many electrons there are in a particular atom, that are going to determine how those two atoms interact with each other. So really, in a nutshell, all chemical reactions involve changes in distribution of electrons between those atoms. So either electrons are sharing atoms with each other, or one is stealing electrons from another. And I'll show you some examples of these different ideas. So while we're talking about these electrons here, let's talk for just a second about the idea of electron orbitals and electron shells. So orbitals are defined as the region in that atom where electrons are going to be found at least 90% of the time, where they're spending most of their time. And then we also have this idea of electron shells or energy shells, energy levels, sometimes they're called, in an atom where you have the smallest shell kind of closest to the atomic nucleus, and then you have a shell that's a little bit farther away, and then another shell that's a little bit farther away still. But what you're seeing here, for example, here you have the first electron shell. Get the next slide here, which has this one sort of cloud circular orbital. So there could be two electrons in this first shell, and they're going to be somewhere within this spherical cloud around the atomic nucleus. And then outside of that first shell, we have a second shell that can hold up to 8 electrons. And this second shell is actually made up of 4 different orbitals, you can see here. So one orbital is just a slightly bigger sphere, and then you have these 3 sort of dumbbell-shaped orbitals. You could imagine 2 electrons in each of these just kind of rotating, figure-8ing around the atomic nucleus. And then you can have additional shells if you have more electrons. and each of these additional shells is also going to hold up to 8 electrons. And so, it's kind of crazy to think about, but if you start piecing just these first two shells together, you end up with these orbitals overlaid on top of each other. It almost looks like a little atomic flower here, right? With all these dumbbell P-shaped orbitals superimposed. But usually, just for simplicity's sake, and in our textbook, you're usually going to see these shells designated just as these rings around the atomic nucleus, right? So for example, we'll go back here. Here's helium. Helium has 2 protons, so it also has 2 electrons. And if I go back, right, remember that first shell can hold 2 electrons. So there's those 2 in the first shell, and that first shell would be filled now. Now, if we wanted to, if we had an atom like lithium, which has another electron, so we've got 3 protons in the nucleus of lithium, thereby we've got 3 electrons. The first 2 are going to go in that first shell, and then the third is going to start filling up the second shell. Okay? And then we've got some bigger elements that'll have a third or potentially even a 4th shell. So taking this back to the idea of atoms interacting with each other, if you have an atom where its outermost shell is full, so basically all the elements here on the right side, so helium, its outermost shell is already full. It's got those 2 electrons in the first shell. Neon, its second shell is the outermost shell, and it's full of 8 electrons. Argon, its third shell is full of 8 electrons. Those are going to be unreactive elements. They're basically satisfied as they are. Their outer shells are full of electrons, and they just don't really see any need to interact with other atoms. Whereas if you have something like carbon, its outer shell, the second shell in this case, has 4 electrons in it, and that second shell could hold up to 8. So carbon is really looking to try to get 4 more electrons in that outer shell. So it's very reactive, and that's one of the reasons you see carbon in the a lot of molecules, right? Especially a lot of biologically important molecules. All right, so there is this what's called the octet rule, which is this defined as the tendency of atoms to try to form stable molecules and fill up their outermost shell. Okay, so and the octet part of that is referring to the fact that, for the most part, right, the outer shell can usually hold up to 8 electrons. And so atoms are going to try to achieve that octet rule, try to achieve stability by either sharing, losing, gaining electrons, and then that is going to have the effect of forming bonds between those atoms. So that's what we're going to talk about in the beginning of the second half of this lecture, is some of these different types of chemical bonds, which are just attractive forces that are holding these atoms together. And you can see in this table here, there's different kinds of chemical bonds. There's covalent bonds, ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic interactions, van der Waals interactions. These are all different types of chemical bonds, and I'll give you a brief description of how these work. So I am going to stop there, and we'll pick this up in the second half.